Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. I'm your host, Clint Davis, and today we have back with us Dr. Joe Malone, Ph.D. Dr. Joe Malone holds a Ph.D. in health and human performance with a minor in neuropsychology and specializes in women's health and sexual wellness. Dr. Malone's taught at Middle Tennessee State University and done a lot of amazing things. You can listen to all those things on the last podcast we're on. He's also been a guest lecturer at Vanderbilt and Princeton and some other major universities. And last time we had a great conversation about neurology and about developmental stages in children and parenting and a lot of good stuff, but we didn't get around to talking about your book, Battle of the Sexes. And so, man, I'm glad you're back. Thanks for coming back on. And I just wanted to kind of talk through your book. And I think as a marriage and family therapist, and a Christian, I think the foundation of the, there it is, Battle of the Sexes. Love
there it is.
Yep. I love the cover too.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love cover art. People say don't judge a book by its cover, but it's hard not to with the real books because you're like, I'm going to grab that one off the shelf.
Well, I wish I could take credit for it, Clint, but my wife and daughter-in-law are the ones that picked that out. I had a different one picked.
Yeah,
that was similar, as retro like that, but they said no, it's this one, and so I was wise enough to let them make the choice.
Yeah, well, the red hair really pops too, so it's like it really does a great job to catch your eye and your attention, and
that's exactly what they said. This one pops.
No, it does. Yeah, I spent a lot of time on our book recently with the cover. I wanted it to be, what I wanted it to be, and so it turned out really, really well, and I was happy with it.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah. So tell us about your book. Tell us about kind of how it came about. I know you covered a little bit of that last time, but just as a refresher.
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me, and I really appreciate it. Appreciate the chance to talk about the book, and really admire your work overall. So thank you for what you do.
Yeah, no problem.
The book really, again, is one of those things that I wasn't ever planning to write a book of this type. It came about, if folks got to hear the other episode, came about as a result of me kind of accidentally becoming a college women's wellness teacher. And that came about because I was working in the fitness industry and had been a part of, because I was giving people chest compressions that were having heart attacks and all of that, how unhealthy our society was in the mid 90s to about the early, mid, I guess, 2005 or so. And I found out that young women's health at the time that they carry their babies has a huge influence on the baby's future health, I guess you'd say. And, it was frustrating back at the fitness industry when we were experiencing those things, those deaths, literally, that it was one of us and 15 of them coming at us if we were personal training.
Right.
And this allowed exponential work, because if we're working with one young woman, you're actually working with probably three people's health, and probably their husband, hopefully, as well, because she'll be influential on him. So that's where I got into this whole thing, taught that college women's personal conditioning class. I literally created it at Middle Tennessee. And along the way, there was all the usual things that you'd expect as far as challenges to them, as far as getting the right food on campus, the exercise and all of that. But really, what really stood out to me as I was doing 32 interviews with them, and then 10 focus groups with 10 of the classes I had, 10 all women's classes, was that what was happening in this hookup culture that they kept telling me about, this culture of casual sex, basically, was much more damaging to them than anything that I had anticipated. So the book was in process. Battles of the Sexes was in process, and it was coming out. It would have come out without that experience and without my PhD changing to what it is. It would have come out just as your standard kind of holistic wellness book, particularly for young women. But I realized in the midst of all of it that, and I feel like maybe God was talking to me here, that this other issue was much bigger and it's something I had not been aware of. And so the book ended up being about 3/4 sexual wellness and only about 1/4 of the holistic wellness that it had originally started out to be.
Yeah.
When we first started it. So it was I think it was a providential pathway that I was on.
Well, it's an amazing one because it's definitely one of the number one issues we have today in our society when it comes to relationships. I think sexual health, man, it's all over the place with books and podcasts and how people should and shouldn't view sexuality. And there's just a lot of a symptom treatment. There's a lot of do this, don't do this, try this. And I think where your book comes in, it really gets to the root causes, some of the biology, some of the neuropsychology, some of the developmental stuff. But it also does a great job of, you obviously have a theology behind it and an idea about how men and women are created. And so I love that balance. And I think as Christians and believers, we have to dig deep into why are we doing things, right? I mean, this is the Asking Why podcast. So it's like when we look at sexual unhealth and we look at hookup culture, it begs the question, well, why is that? And you could say, well, men are this way and girls are this way. And you go, well, why is that? And, well, they're exposed to this. Well, why is that? And, we have to keep going. And I think a lot of times people just want the simple answer and the fix, but they don't want to dig into the why.
Right. Well, that's, as I was saying earlier, that's what I admire so much about your work is that you take that approach, the Asking Why podcast, because why, I think, why answers all the other questions, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to do it, and all of that type of thing. I think if you understand the why of things, then you can go from there. And that's really what this book, this Battles of the Sexes book is all about, is supplying people, and particularly young adult type people, or maybe even, high school, I'd say probably maybe junior in high school and older, a good roadmap of what's happening if they happen to be a female or on the other side a male, what's happening in their brains and in their development compared to what's happening to the other sex. So an effect of it, I think, that I've seen has been that it's really equipped these young people, the ones that I've dealt with, and then even older people. I'll tell you the story in a minute, but these young people going through all this hormonal turmoil, that they're going through puberty, and then past puberty, it continues on to really about age 30, when all this and it's all good, by the way, motivation really to find a mate and get married, be sexual with them, create children, and create a family. It's all good and natural, put in the context of what it used to be when marriage was expected, before sex and that type of thing. So, but you take away that expectation. The way I look at guardrail, basically, the guardrails that God has put into place, then we're in the situation we're in today that you were describing, such a helter-skelter, so much gender confusion, confusion about the whole situation, roles that they're supposed to take, and that type of thing. So, so the book has been, I think, helpful to a lot of young people. But I was going to mention that one of my neighbors here, she's probably in her 70s. I gave her a copy of the book, and we're out walking and often see each other. And she held it up to me a while back, and because she'd actually been reading as she was walking, and she goes, "I sure wish I had this back when I was in high school."
Right.
But people that are older have confided to me too that it's helped them if they're married and in their marriages and that type of thing too. So it's just a good basic, I think, biological set of knowledge for most people to have that most people don't have right now.
Yeah. Can you give us kind of a general overview of if a parent's listening to this, or just an individual, and they're like, well, what are they talking about? All these kind of stages and hormonal things. Like, I think one of the problems with biology, people will ask me to come and speak on homosexuality or transgender issues. And I was at a conference a while back, and I said, what's sad is that you guys want me to speak on this, but if I asked you how heterosexual sex works, you couldn't tell me. So it's
Right.
like we don't understand the basic biology of like normal sexual development and normal health, and then we want to talk about like a smaller group of people. And again, not to say we shouldn't figure those things out and talk through those things and have opinions about them, but I find that most people haven't even figured out their own stuff before trying to criticize or judge some other situation. So, can you give us kind of an overview of that?
Yes, I can. And to your point you just made, I think is really important as far as just looking at what's happening in society today, as far as the numbers go. That was what really struck me, Clint, when I was contemplating going into this field was the numbers of heterosexuals compared to the numbers of non-heterosexuals. Again, scientifically, we could say that it's about 96% and change that are heterosexual. So that leaves us, 3% and change that aren't. And, you go into the transgender and you go to all the different things, and the number, and we can talk about this later if you want, but the numbers are tiny in those situations. And like you said, not to minimize what they're going through and their experience, but you have 96% plus of the population that's having all these issues, with sexual aggression, misunderstandings between the sexes, sexual conflict, and then, they're kind of ignored, like you said. And so it's important, I think, that, I guess, proportionally, it's important that we realize, what the proportions are, and that for sure the 96% deserve a lot of attention. So getting to that, a lot of things become more apparent when you realize that hormonal influences are a huge part of our lives, and they start before even we're born. In fact, a lot of who we are in sexual orientation, for instance, is determined before we're born. It's, again, your typical process. Well, first of all, again, the babies are all start off as females. I'm going to use the term babies, not fetus, because I do believe that it's a baby and a living person in there.
Me too.
Okay, good. I thought so, but
it's crazy though. You got to say that, right? It's the caveat nowadays.
It is crazy to say that. Have to say it, but that's the times we're living through. But the exposures to testosterone, if it's an XY baby, XY chromosome baby, it's what really changes the whole thing from what would have been a female baby being born to a male baby being born. And then those, really, it's amazing that during that time period that in utero, the male baby is exposed to adult levels of testosterone, and then it goes down to near zero at birth, and then it goes back up to adult levels between age born and 6 months, and then it goes back down to same levels as the female baby has. So what's happening there is that the brains, the genitalia are being formed, and the brains are being organized in either a male typical almost always, or almost always female typical type of arrangement in the brain. And then again, once puberty is hit, later down the line, then those circuits are going to be activated for either a male typical activities and development, or female. So really hormones explain a lot of all of that. And then also, as we go through our life, hit puberty and all of that type of thing, it explains a lot of what's happening there. An example I think that jumps out at us, and this is something your audience might not know, to illustrate that, how important hormones are. And I'll get back to the book, kind of its lessons as we go along. But I want to say this, because most people don't know this. You can see how much hormone exposure, just in the physiological process, how much effect it has, by two examples of two conditions that people probably aren't familiar with, but may have heard of. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia is one of them. And what that is that in utero, a baby, well, girl or boy, is exposed to higher androgens. And an androgen is kind of the overall term for the male hormones, male-dominated hormones, including testosterone. In that case, the male babies aren't really affected, but the female babies are born with more masculine characteristics. As a matter of fact, as they grow older, they have more masculine characteristics, as far as toy play and preferences that way, but also sexual aggression. They're more sexually aggressive on average than your typical, female, normal female. The other one that's really interesting is called CAIS, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Have you heard of that before?
I haven't.
Okay. This is a good one for all of us that work with people to know about, because it really kind of lays out an insight on what's happening there. These babies, again, again, all of the default situation is female up to about 6 to 8 weeks. We all have female characteristics, up to 6 to 8 weeks. When the XY babies they form testes, and it starts secreting testosterone. But these CAIS babies are born that way. They're male, but complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is what CAIS means that their cells, for whatever reason, it's some sort of a kind of a defect, their receptors won't accept the androgen, and so
yeah, I know what you're talking about now. Okay.
Yeah, so they're meant to have been a male, but when they're born, they have all the characteristics of a female, and they only find out that they're not a regular female when they hit puberty, because at that point they don't have a period and that type of thing. So they don't have the normal functions that a normal female can have as far as getting pregnant and all that type of thing. So, but for all outward appearances, they look very female because they cannot, they don't react to androgens, particularly testosterone and its masculinizing effect. So, having said that, when you look at things like transgender, when you look at things like intersex meaning you having both, ambiguous type of genitalia, you don't really know which one they are, male or female, at birth. Again, all of it seems to be laid at the door of a really, in these cases, transgender, especially, very, very rare abnormality that comes about. Mm-hmm. So we can come back and talk about that later if you want. But
so I think part of what I would say to that is, one of the things I think is happening in our culture is when we try to talk about these situations, if you're a person that the shoe doesn't fit, right? If you feel like, well, hold on, that's not me, then there becomes a fence, or there becomes a feeling of, well, you're not including me in the conversation, or my story's not being told. And in some ways, rightly so. Like, I think everybody deserves to be heard, and everybody's story needs to be told. And I think, as a clinician, and as we talk about these things, it's important for people to know, like, if you came to, and I know this about you, but if somebody with these struggles came to you, if they come to me, I want to hear their story. I want to hear their birth plan. I want to hear what happened to them and what their life was like. And then we can make some decisions based on their story. So I know you're not, and I'm not trying to give a broad stroke of how this happens for everybody. But I think what's also happened is that, and the goal of our talk today is we would have to talk for hours about that and tackle that. But this 96% of people who didn't have these issues in birth, these particular issues, we all have birth issues. Everybody has hormonal issues that change them and that create issues and being predisposed to certain addictions and certain, arousal templates and all those kind of things happen. So I just wanted to give that caveat that, like, this episode is not about transgenderism and talking about it, but it's super helpful to understand how hormones work and how they do affect those things, so we can look at the general population and say, hey, y'all got some real big issues that are happening that's affecting, 96% of the population affects that 4% greatly. And so if it's as healthy as it can possibly be, then we can do a better job of loving on and helping people who struggle with some of these things that are more isolated. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Yes, and I'm losing part of your audio here as we're going along, so I'm getting part of it.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. But yeah, that perfectly sets up what I was going to say about the book, is that the goal of the book is, as you said, to really speak to that 96% that have all these issues that they're all kind of struggling with all the throughout especially their adolescence and young adulthood. And they really don't have any knowledge, or very little knowledge, of what's behind a lot of it. So the book really goes into again, the differences between males and females, as far as heterosexual male and female, as they develop through adolescence and into and through young adulthood. The fact that there are 3 areas in the male's brain having to do with sexual pursuit that are twice as big as those in the female brain. They're packed with twice as many neurons, and they're sensitive to testosterone, and males on average have 20 times more testosterone than females do. Males also, I mean, females also have 13 times more sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG, which is it's a hormone. It's a biochemical that binds with testosterone and estrogen,
Hmm.
and makes it inactive, kind of like the CAIS, where it's inactive. So females also have that, which is again lowering down their level, their sex drive, other than particular times, like particular times in their cycle, if they're naturally cycling and not on hormonal birth control. So that's the first thing we try to lay out in the book is, and for parents listening, is to understand that it's like a supercharged sexual pursuit brain in the males on average, and it's a much less charged in that direction female type of a situation when you have a natural situation going on. So that's the first thing. Some males have 183 times more testosterone than some of the low females. When you test them, when you put them on a graph, let's see if I can do this. Normally on a height graph, the tails between males and females, the tails will cross, because there's some females that are taller than some males. On testosterone, they don't cross. The lowest male is at 200 nanograms per deciliter of blood, and the highest female is at 75. So
Wow.
it's a huge mismatch that parents and young people need to understand. Now, I will say this, and I know you've dealt with this probably in many of your podcasts, this issue, but I think the advent of porn, I think, is having a numbing and a downward effect, particularly on males' testosterone workings. Also, testosterone has been dropping. And I think the best evidence on what's going on with that, dropping as in like 1% a year for about the last 40 years in our young men, and also sperm counts have been dropping as well, about the same percentage wise.
Yep.
So those things are happening, and it may be dampening down, this mismatch I'm describing here, but it's still largely in place. So
you're saying,
again,
let me reframe that. So you're
yeah.
saying that we have seen a reduction. One of the things that people are saying is that teenagers are not having as much sex as they were in the past, right? That's a statistical thing we know, is that on one hand, we're like, kids are off to the races with having all this extracurricular sex and non-committal and premarital sex. And in some ways that's true, but
Right.
but in other ways, like, high schoolers are not having as much sex. But what they're leaving out is that that's because of pornography and masturbation addiction and that culture. It's like, well, they're not having as much sex with other people because they're just doing whatever they want to with themselves, and that's causing other problems that we have yet to deal with, like the reduction of all these things. Erectile dysfunction is super huge in the 18 to 24-year-old range, and so you have this historically super high testosterone driven male culture who it's easily to get aroused, it's easy to procreate, all those things, which is a problem, can be a problem. But now that same group of people is having all these struggles with testosterone and with erectile dysfunction and with, being in control of their own sexual ideologies and identities. And so, yeah, it's been a very quick flip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you described that extremely well, and I completely agree. So there is that issue, at hand. But when it comes to non-consensual sex, sexual assaults, rape, those types of things, for instance, on college campuses, which I was involved heavily in trying to prevent. This whole issue of the difference between males and females, and how the males are supercharged towards casual sex, and the females, in a lot of cases, would rather not take part in it, but they take part because they think they need to, and they're kind of pressured into it. It's still a huge issue, and I don't think it ever will go away. One other thing that the book points out is how important in this whole picture that alcohol is typically.
Oh, wow.
Because, yeah, alcohol, and you probably know this already, but if there's anything that acts as an aphrodisiac to women, it would be alcohol because it raises their testosterone levels. And especially if they're around that fertile window, a day about 8 through 14 on their cycle. If their cycle starts, if it starts with their period on day number 1, so about, ends on day 5, day 8 through 14. If they're drinking, in a social situation and they're at that peak, fertility, basically, which is what that is, then there's a real tendency on their part to sometimes take part in things that they might not do otherwise. And I think that's one of the reasons that alcohol is such a big part of the college social life, and particularly with fraternities and things like that, is that they realize, whether it's consciously or intuitively, they realize that. So that's something that parents should be aware of. And, again, the statistics the book cites is that it's about 80% of non-consensual sex on college campuses that takes place in the context of a hookup. And something that's really, gotten my attention over the years is how much emphasis, and rightfully so, there's been put on college campuses, in particular on rape and what they call rape culture. But the thing that doesn't make any sense to me is why these same administrators that are rightfully concerned about non-consensual sex or sexual assault, rape, whatever you want to call it, on campus, why they're not concerned with the hookup culture situation, because it's 80% of the context. Hookup culture is 80% of the context for rapes and other types of non-consensual sex to take place. So my advice to them has always been, and actually more than advice, I'm advocating for them to try to step into this hookup culture situation and try to discourage it, because if you discourage it, you're going to be discouraging much of the non-consensual or rape or sexual assault, however you want to describe it. So
that's a great way to put it. I mean, you're advocating and also affirming that there is a huge problem within college campuses of rape culture in some regard. When that comes out, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot on both sides who are the right who's saying no, there's not. This is all made up. There's no any of that's not true. And you have the left who is like all of it's every guy there is a danger to raping someone and pushing someone. And I think what you and I see within the developmental stages and within just the social context of you have parents who are divorced, you have boys who are higher driven by testosterone, girls who are being taught to be submissive and that their bodies are bad and it's only a tool for the male. You have these kids who are seeing porn and being traumatized and then going into, high school. No one's mentoring them. Very few people are teaching them about sex in their body. Very few people are teaching them what dating is. We don't know what dating is or what's happening. Most of them are hooking up with people between 12 and 14 for the first time. And we're not teaching our little boys who are driven by testosterone what consent is and how they need to be asking and what they need to be doing. And we're not teaching our little girls these lessons. And then, by the time they get to college, of course it's a mess. Like, of course it's a disaster, when they get alone and they drink and they, their inhibitions are lowered. And like you're saying, not only are their inhibitions lowered, but literally their testosterone and their hormones are changing in the prime time of, having babies. So it's, we don't talk about these kind of root issues enough. And part of the book, Building Better Bridges, that I wrote and that's coming out is that discussion. It's like, as parents, let's take it even earlier. I mean, we all have to have our areas of advocating, and I love that you advocate in these areas of teen and young adult, because I'm not doing that. But what I am advocating for is like, man, it starts like you're saying, it starts in the womb. It starts at 3 and 4 and 5 with how we teach and parent our boys and our girls around their bodies, around consent, around safety. And very few people got taught that, so very few people are teaching it.
I couldn't agree more. Beautiful. You have a beautiful way of expressing that, and I think you're way ahead of the game as far as your realization on really what you're teaching is the same thing I'm trying to teach. You're advocating for at a younger age, and I'm advocating that let's get into when they're probably 16 to 22, especially because I'll talk about what happens in the brain there in a minute. But we're both really advocating for sexual integrity
Yes.
education, sexual integrity education, rather than just sex education as it's been understood before. And again, the reason that you, I think, are outlining there so well is that in this society, you mentioned the 12 to 14, practicing, and they're also, as you know, they're being exposed to pornography on average at age 10 to 13.
Yeah,
So
20 hours of, I read the stat last week, that by 11, the average child has watched 20 hours of porn.
that's amazing. I mean, think about when we were 11 years old.
I mean,
Think about what.
you might have snuck a magazine, like, and you might have saw some breasts, but you might have saw, a nude picture, but 20 hours of HD 4K, abuse is just unreal.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, my point. I think you would agree with me on this, and I think it's your point as well. We just haven't talked it over yet, but if we don't educate our children as you're advocating, then their sex educator is going to be porn. Porn to start off with, and then their classmates and whoever else is out there, kind of on this experimental edge, so to speak, in the middle grade and middle schools and all that. So yeah, I think in the past, when you look at sex education as it was originally taught, and we can get back to the book in a minute here, but it was originally taught as hygiene. They taught as hygiene as part of the courses, at the
Health
probably
class.
middle school. Yeah, health class, middle school, and it was taught in the way that here's these things, that can happen. Here's how it works. Here's the fundamentals of it. Kind of the nuts and bolts, so to speak. The physical process, but it also was taught. There's also a cautionary element to it, as far as all these things can happen that are bad to you, but it's just best. It's best to save it for later in your life, and when you're married, and you're committed to somebody. And then it has evolved into what it is now, which is, comprehensive sexuality education is pretty much avocation of early sexual activity, and then a lot of different types of sexual activity as well.
Yeah, it's wild,
So
these videos of these dads going to the school boards and bringing a book from the library,
yeah,
reading the actual book out loud, and then being kicked out for inappropriate talk. It's like,
yeah,
you're reading the book that's in the library that kids can get off the shelf and read, but you're not allowed to say the words out loud in front of adults.
I find that, Clint, to be the ultimate irony.
Oh, it's unbelievable, man.
We have to the school board saying we have to obey FCC rules. Well, why is this in your library?
Right.
That's the next question. But yes, so agreed totally on kids need to be educated on this, because we really don't have any choice. They're going to be educated one way or the other, and I think it's really, really corrupting the type of education they're getting outside of what you're describing. So I am totally behind you, and actually we're kindred spirits. We're both doing the same thing, just at different ages.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, me too, because there aren't very many people that have had that realization. I like to call it sexual integrity education, because
It's good.
we want kids to handle sex, with integrity, and when it's handled with integrity, then it's a wonderful thing. It's such a beautiful and powerful thing, and it leads to so many of the most rewarding things in life. When it isn't, it's really, really can be destructive, and really tear lives up, as we both know. So, on that line, the book goes into another thing as far as bonding goes, and again, it turns out males bond differently than females. There's this neurotransmitter biochemical called vasopressin that really, I don't want to go into necessarily the details, because I may have done it last time, but it really kind of points up the importance and really the validity of the old school approach to dating and courtship and that type of thing. The saving it, the actual sex for marriage, because if a young man is in that situation where he's around this young woman that he really is, loves, infatuated with, strongly attracted to, this chemical vasopressin is present in his brain, and it starts to form, starts to encourage receptors for it to be formed. And if a long enough time goes by where this is happening, again, the courtship, the classic courtship, going to movies, going to dinner, hugging each other, kissing, that type of thing, but not, having sex, particularly to orgasm, because orgasm wipes out the vasopressin buildup, basically. So if it goes on long enough, and on college campuses, I always get, Dr. Malone, how long, how long does it take? I hate to give that one up, but I want to tell them the truth. Like on your show here, you always tell people the truth. So I have to do it eventually too. But anyway, there's reasons why that traditional courtship works for, towards driving young people toward marriage, which is what it's supposed to do. And also biblically, most religions, not just Christian, but most religions would carry through with that same expectation, of saving sex for marriage. So there's a reason in the bonding process of the males, when the vasopressin bonding, when the vasopressin docking of the hormone takes place, then he becomes somewhat possessive of her, and also his testosterone drops. At every level of commitment, a male's testosterone drops, starting with girlfriend, engagement, marriage, and then when he has a child, if he holds a child, it's an amazing thing. Pheromonally, holds a child, there's a huge drop in his testosterone. But that allows back to when he's falling in love, which is what we're talking about, bonding, male bonding. When he has fallen in love on the vasopressin level, his testosterone drops, and he's able to his oxytocin, which is antagonistic to testosterone. Testosterone drives it down, and vice versa. His oxytocin can rise to the level where it bonds him to her as well. So it's a double stage process with the male and the female, and from the male's perspective, to the female. The reason I discovered, the main reason, the girls in the classes that I was teaching, the college women that I was dealing with, so many were brokenhearted and just their hearts torn out by these guys, is because they have a tendency to bond in the midst of sex. All they need is their oxytocin and their dopamine to rise. Males need dopamine, testosterone, and dopamine, testosterone, and vasopressin to bond. Females just need oxytocin, and dopamine.
So let me see if I catch what you're saying. I think for the average listener, if they think about relationships, right, the goal would be for a male and a female, if we're talking about heterosexuality, for dating and bonding not to necessarily be sexual, right? For the male, there needs to be bonding and connection that's not just driven by sex, and intimacy isn't just sex. And so
right.
the safer they are without sex, and the more they can love the female, not just for their body or for the orgasm, but for all the other relational pieces over time.
Yes.
But when they have sex, then all of that's blasted out and flooded and overwhelmed. But if they don't have the bond, then they can just have sex and they don't have any connection and they don't have any intimacy. And then they're off to the next female to plant their seed and do the same thing. Whereas in the female, they have sex and all of that bonding happens right then, and now they're attached and attuned and bonded in a way that is hard to separate out separately than how a male would form it. Is that accurate? Am I saying that?
Yeah,
right?
that's completely accurate. Yeah, well said. Yes, and that's why there's so many heartbroken, just generally in society, females, as opposed, percentage-wise, as opposed to males, is because it's a simpler process for the females to bond, to fall in love, I guess you'd say.
Which is crazy that we would even argue that as a society. Well, one, that we would try to say that biologically men and women are the same thing, when, you're showing, and science shows, that clearly even within sex and even with bonding and relationships, that's very different. Again, I'm sure there are spectrums of people within those statistics that don't fit and adhere to it, but on the general large population of men and women, that's what we're talking about. And it's crazy that we would think, well, one, that we would shame little boys and teenagers for being this way, instead of preparing them and protecting them for that difficulty that they're going to find themselves in, and that we wouldn't then equip and support females in saying, hey, do not have sex with boys, and think that you're going to keep them if you're doing it in this unhealthy pattern of casual dating and casual sex, like you're setting yourself up, female, biologically, to be in a lot of heartbreak and to be in a lot of seeking after and searching after, and male, you're not going to be connected by having sex with her if you don't have a relationship with her. It's actually going to make you probably turned off to her and wanting to move on to the next thing. And it's crazy that we're not teaching our kids these things and discipling them, from a biblical worldview, because you go back to Genesis, and it's literally telling us that. It's literally saying, because of the fall, husband, you're going to lord your power over this woman, and you're going to, be over her. And female, you're going to seek after your husband and long for that connection and that emotion, and it's going to be hard for you to get.
Yeah. Genesis 3:16. That's one of the big verses that when I'm speaking to Christian audiences,
yeah,
I say, we all know that John 3:16 is important, but so is Genesis 3:16.
That's good, man.
So, no, you're totally right. And as a matter of fact, this is something that all girls and young women particularly should know. And I want to talk about chivalry, so make sure I come back to this.
Yeah.
Chivalry. But literally, like you said, these are population averages, that we're talking about. So there's exceptions to all of these things we're talking about, but the large percentage will fit into what we're talking about. A man, when they're in a situation where they're dating, a woman, or even a girl and a boy, let's say teenagers, the male side of it will look at the situation, and if it's easy, so to speak, for him to have sex with her, he'll have a tendency to categorize her into one category, meaning that for a good time only. And if he isn't able to, this is hopefully probably later when they're men and women, but if he's looking for a marriage partner, if she isn't that way, if she is, insist on chastity and saving sex for marriage, he'll categorize her into the other one for marriage. So when you think about it, Clint, this is, it's laid down, as you said, in Genesis, but it also, interestingly enough, is laid down in the scientific research, because going back, when you think about our ancestors, we've had thousands and thousands and thousands of generations of ancestors. And really the human race, humanity itself, is really, as I kind of came down to it in my research, it's really founded on sexual integrity. Mm-hmm. That's the reason it's become kind of the centerpiece of my research and kind of what I'm known for, sexual integrity scientist. And here's what it is. The balance is that females over time, and then also, other species, this is true as well, most other species, females practice what we call female choice, because they have the rare commodity. The eggs they have, are 10 million times in volume what the sperm size is, for one thing. Has the, all of the nutrition and that type of thing for the developing baby. And they only have, it sounds like a lot, but they only have about 7 million of them in utero. And then they're degenerating. Once they have them, the degeneration process starts in. At birth, they have 1.5 million left out of the 7 million. At puberty, they have 400,000. And every month that they cycle, there's been several thousands that come out and degenerate. Only one follicle matures and becomes a viable egg. So their supply is going down all the time. Males, and they only have so many, and when they run out of them, we call that menopause. Okay, so with the males, though, once they hit puberty and then once they start producing sperm, the sperm are like a conveyor belt. Like every 60 days, they've created a bunch more sperm, and it's like at 2,000 a second. So there's about 250 million in a typical ejaculate. So the females have they have the scarce commodity. Uh-huh. And so our females and females across really nature are the ones that choose. They call it female choice for the most part. They're the gatekeepers. They're the ones that determine whether sex happens or not, and with who normally.
And that's a funny part. I want to get us off on a segue, but
sure,
there are some natural biological things that happen that I hear in therapy in life that is the thing. Like, well, women can, lots of times women are the ones in marriage who say whether we can or can't have sex. Now, obviously in a healthy way we want to be consensual about that, but there is a biological reason for why it tilts and leans that way, which is so interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate you pointing these out as we go along, because it's so much in my head that oftentimes I don't think to myself, well, they need to know what you just said, you know.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
need to fill in people that you fill in the blanks for them. But on the other hand, okay, so we got female choice, and it's really dual, because it's not only is it on their, you know, good genes, which would mean in the guy, which would mean good looking, you know, handsome, masculine, muscular, maybe all of those type of things that women find attractive, but also, you know, who he is as a person. Is he dependable? Is he going to be there, you know, when the babies are, when I'm pregnant and when the babies are coming, and for the family, is he going to support the family, and that type of thing? So it's dual. It's a dual choice. On the other side of it, though, and this is the important one that most young people and parents don't know about. The reason the guy is, you know, making those categorizations that I mentioned just a minute ago, generally, and these are especially like high testosterone alpha male types that most women are attracted to, and also maybe have had a lot of sexual experience. The reason he's making the categorization that he is not so much of a chauvinistic, you know, kind of he-man, self-confidence, all that. It's coming from insecurity. And this goes, again, way back into our ancestors. It's called paternity certainty. You know, our species has internal gestation. And so really the woman is the only one that really knows who the father of that particular child is. And so in that insecurity, probably young man that finds this young woman that, you know, despite maybe his best attempts, it won't give in to him and go in that direction. His supercharged young male brain maybe wants to go. He starts thinking about her the way that he does, because he wants to be able to be sure that going forward, and again, this may be unconscious, it may not be in his conscious mind, but his unconscious mind, he wants to know for sure that, you know, she's going to be loyal to him. And as a matter of fact, sexual loyalty is the number one most preferred trait in a woman that a man, again, it's a huge study they did, a man is going to be preferring for a wife. Mm-hmm. So yeah, females need to know that they may have been told by their parents. Even I had two young women that one was her dad that told her this, and the other was her mom. And in both cases, those spouses had messed their own marriages up by committing adultery. But they advised their children, their daughters, that they would never get a guy if they didn't, you know, have sex with him, you know, for the guy to try him out and that type of thing in this day and age. And I told them, you know, at the time, I said, that's absolutely the worst advice, you know, you could get, because of what we're talking about here. Paternity certainty. The young man wants to know, for a woman that he's going to invest the rest of his life in, that she is loyal to him, and sexually especially. And the other thing is, when these young women do engage in you know, quick sex, you know, sex up front in the relationship, another interesting research study showed that these guys, particularly these high testosterone alpha male types, in their minds, within 10 seconds after orgasm, the woman is diminishing in their appeal to them. They think they're less attractive, less funny, less smart, less all the positive things. So within 10 seconds after orgasm. Now, again, we talked about this before, but the woman, because of her different chemistry, she's having the opposite reaction. Mm-hmm. After sex, he's looking better and better. You know, he's better looking, he's smarter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the book, and I think that research has been done. I did that research since the book, but that's kind of what the book is trying to get across, is that really, when you think about it, men and women, these young men and women, where their hormones are so much different, are seeing life through a completely different set of lenses. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to sex, comes to relationships, it's no wonder that the 96% we're talking about here, there's so many train wrecks, you know, when it comes to relationships. And that's a big part of what the book is about too, it talks to both sides. It talks to the males and the females, and goes into what's happening in both. And the idea is that both of them learn about themselves, first of all, and then secondly, learn about the opposite sex, so that you can develop what we call sexual empathy. So One last thing that I think your listeners should hear here that kind of sums it all up as advice to if they have young people or if they are young person themselves, is that the research has shown that the shorter the time to sex in a relationship, the shorter the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say that one more time. The shorter the time to sex, in other words, if it happens first date, second date, whatever, and the shorter the time to sex in a relationship, the shorter the relationship lasts. So, my really, really strong advice to anybody listening to this is reserve sex for marriage, and tell your young people to reserve sex for marriage, because we want that happy ending. We want that happy marriage, happy family, and all of the good things that brings to not only them, but also to society. So to contrast that, one other thing the book goes into is what happens typically these days, when that doesn't happen. In the 1950s, the typical age, the median age was 20, or right around 20 years old. We don't have that happening now, I think near 30, that the median age of marriage is, if at all. So what happens to these young men with all this, testosterone, who haven't been taught chivalry, coming back to that, who haven't been taught, the chivalry and to, how to respectfully treat women and to be on the lookout, which is what I think you're describing you do, and you advocate from young boys on up, be teaching them these things. And that marriage is a great goal, because it has a huge influence on your success of your life or not. So what's happening instead, though, is that a lot of these boys are coming, as you mentioned, I think, from broken homes, from homes where their father in most cases isn't there, and they're going out single onto the streets. Well, this is, the streets become their parents, their father in particular. And the age from 15 to 25 is what I call the male danger zone, and also I call it the testosterone trap, because that's what's happening behind the scenes, as you're saying, that's driving everything. They're not married, they're not settled down, and so they're out there, and they're rivals with other young males of that type. So parents of boys, here's an important statistic for you to keep in mind. Boys from 15 to 25 have about a 4 times greater chance of death by homicide, suicide, drug overdose, or car accident than females of the same age. And again, much of it's because of what's driving underneath the surface, which is what you're getting at, Clint, with asking why, podcast. It's driving this behavior that's putting them into problems with that. Now, most of us think about, the inner cities and the gangs and that type of thing, the things that are going on. We think that drugs, the drug trade is what's driving most of this, and people get killed over drugs. No, it's about 2/3 of it is not over drugs. It's over relationships between the young men, and over half of those. So the majority of the deaths that are happening by homicide are over status competition. They're competing for status. They think the females care, and I think in most cases the females don't care, particularly to the point of them getting killed. But that's what it is. And to me, it appears to me that the ideal, and I know I'm going to get in trouble with this because I'm saying something that isn't accepted very, very much these days, but the whole thing paints a picture to me that, the sex drive and all of it, particularly the male sex drive, earlier marriage appears to make sense to me. Again, females peak fertility is age 19 to 29, males is 24 to 26, and again, it seems like, and again, if you at every stage of commitment, the male's testosterone drops, and so marriage in most cases, in many cases, drives young men towards becoming more responsible, becoming more of a giver, more honorable. You can go right through the stats as far as staying out of jail, staying out of the bars, all the different destructive things. So,
and then you give them a kid and they hold it, and their testosterone drops more
by 50%.
Yeah.
And not only that, their estrogen goes up, which helps, because estrogen is the buddy with oxytocin. And here's a great one: their cortisol drops by 300%.
So there's a huge stress hormone for those that don't know.
Yeah. So to me, I get in trouble because I use the M word, marriage, but I think marriage, and particularly earlier marriage, is a huge missing ingredient here as far as the well-being of our society. And you probably have heard this, but and your audience may have too, but in case you haven't, one of the big projections recently is that by 2030, our female population from age 25 to 44, 45% of them are going to be unmarried and childless.
Mm-hmm.
So by 2030, which is only 7 years away, we're going to have 45% of our 25 to 44-year-old women that are unmarried and childless if things don't change. So anyway, that's really sobering to me, because
Yeah.
society doesn't run well when you I just mentioned the what happens on the male side of it when they're unmarried, and then on the female side I think that there's a lot of negativity as well, and also of course this whole birth gap thing with countries, our country included, but not as bad as some, where we've got so few young people in comparison to so many older people, and the problems that's going to bring about. So all that said, the book is really kind of a base. It's really a base, kind of a base place to start. I've done 6 years of research since then, and my view of what we need to do, what's going on, and what we need to do to kind of avert the catastrophe that's looming towards us is this direction that I'm describing, where we have a swing in the pendulum back towards the more traditional approaches, and starting with your specialty, which is working with especially the boys and girls as they're growing up, and making them aware, using sexual integrity education with them, and letting them know there's such great things that can happen with sex, but there's all these other destructive potentials for it too, the way it's being handled right now. So anyway, does that make sense?
Oh, it makes sense to me. I mean, I know it's like drinking out of a fire hose for people, but I mean, it's putting the science on and the why onto so many things that I think as a culture, and especially within a Christian worldview, makes sense. The thing that brings up for me in my head is what I'm already talking about, which is what's going on in society as at large that has extended us getting married later, that has, extended, all of these things from where they were. And again, there's a bunch of documentaries on child marriage and how toxic and horrible that is. And I know you're not advocating for that, and neither am I. No. We want people to go through puberty and to become, an individualized, mature person before they choose their spouse for the rest of their life. However, 30 is, midlife in some ways, almost to 40 before people are getting married. If that's the median age, then, why is that? And I think we could get in a bigger discussion about, and we did a podcast on this a while back, but like, what is success? And what are people's ideals, and what do they teach their children is their morals and their values as a family? Well, one, if we know that over 50% of that word family is already broken through divorce, then that is teaching children ideal right off the bat. When 56% of the country, their kid is, a product of divorce, then we're teaching them a lesson about marriage and about how important it is and how valuable it is right then. And again, this is not to shame anybody who's been divorced. I'm not above making mistakes or ending up in a divorce by any means. So I have to watch it and, get help and do work. But at the same time, like the research is the research. And so how do we lower divorce rates? Well, we have to have community, and we have to have support, and we have to love on men and women. Well, how do we do that? Well, we have to start when they're kids, and we have to raise boys and girls and men and women to value themselves and value each other and understand the science. And for me as a Christian, it's like God is revealing to us through science and through research and through trauma and through education how He's created us. And He showed us how He's created our hormones and our bodies and how those things weave together. And we can just look at our society and look at culture and look at the world and see that when we go off course from that, how devastating it is for women and children in particular, but men as well. And I think what we're both getting at is we're in trouble. And that's, we're trying to ring the bell here and say, listen, we're not doomsdayers. We're not saying that the world's going to end tomorrow, but everybody's already acknowledging this. everybody who looks around and says, why are these kids anxious and depressed and suicidal? Why are these kids confused? Why are these young college kids who 20 years ago were in the prime of their life all miserable and depressed and anxious? Why is it that, these huge statistical, groups of people are having erectile dysfunction? Why is it that there's such a rape culture? Why is it that drugs and alcohol and pornography are the heavy addictions that are coming into all of the stuff is moving younger and younger when it comes to negativity? But the thing that keeps people from doing that, which is a marriage and a family and children and community and purpose, is getting extended into the 30s and 40s. Then you have these two things crashing. And I mean, just our conversation today, sorry, I'm externalizing that. I haven't thought of it that way, but it's like, yeah, so our the thing that keeps us biologically safe is having a spouse, having a marriage, having children, changes our hormones, lowers our testosterone, raises our estrogen, brings us into safety and security, so that we don't need to act like psychos and do all these coping and negative things. We're pushing that into the 30s and 40s while exposing children to hypersexual material, hyper-violent material, hyper-adult content, and then telling them relationships aren't that important. Consensual relationships, committed relationships aren't that important. You can do that later in life. And then the research shows that there's no way you're going to be able to do that later in life. The divorce rate is climbing even higher because of that. And yet we're telling them that same message. And then if we say this in some world, that's contradictory or somehow dramatic.
Yeah.
Does that sum it up? Sorry.
Yeah, no, completely. I couldn't have said it any better. No, yeah, and it's ironic. It's kind of like the irony we talked about earlier on the college campuses. But yeah, you're exactly right, and that's really all the different points of it that there are. I think so. Yeah, I think you really summed it up well there. And your approach with the young kids. This. I'm sure some of your listeners might not, but where you're talking about, starting teaching them these things, right, soon as you can after birth and that type of thing. Well, there's two huge growth spurts, when it comes to development of children. One is from in utero, of course. There's a lot of things happening as we described, but up to age 7, the brain is, it doubles by the time they're 1 in size, and then it's 80% by the time of their adult size by age 3, and it's 90 by age 5. So from about, from birth to age 7, that's prime time for all those neurons that are going to be pruned. They're getting billions of neurons extra than they need, but the ones that are used stay and the other ones get pruned. So there's that developmental window. But then the other one that I think that a lot of people aren't aware of is from puberty through about age 24, and particularly from about age 16. So think like a high school junior through, a grad student. And probably the prime time of that is 18 to 22, when the brain is doing what I just described, way too many neurons. And again, experience is things that get used stay, and the others are pruned. And attitudes, worldview that's put in at that time stays, and probably a lot of things, other worldviews don't stay. The other important thing for people to realize is that young, kind of emerging adult, I think that we're calling it these days, time period has this other element to it called GABA, the GABA system in the brain. And again, here's where science can help us, as you said. Gamma aminobutyric acid is what that means. Literally, that's not important necessarily to know that. If you want to know, listeners, more about it, just search GABA, GABA. G is in great, and it is the largest inhibitory neurotransmitter system in the brain. And really, it doesn't come online until starting about maybe 17, 18. And it's kind of getting warmed up age like about 16 or so. And again, it doesn't finish until probably 24. But again, the prime time is probably 18 to 22, the undergraduate years of college. So this is the thing that really sets humans apart. Well, first of all, it sets adults apart from children and adolescents, because it allows us to pick and choose, what we're going to say yes to and what we're going to say no to. And again, kind of make a habit of that one way or the other, which again is kind of a worldview. The other thing is it's what primarily separates us from any of the other animal species. Like you take our closest, the chimpanzees share 99% of our DNA. They don't have GABA neurons, though, in their prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain, which is the executive part of the brain. So it appears to me that, God also intended for us to live in this way where we develop discipline, we develop, chastity, we develop chivalry on the side, on the male side of things. And we're designed to live by a code. And that code, I think, lends itself to, again, marriage, family, children, your place in society, and all of that. So that is, as you beautifully described a minute ago, that's what's been pulled, the rug's been pulled out from under us as far as our expectations in society. And so all the things you described, all those different points of negativity have cropped up. And as you described it, it's no wonder. I mean, we shouldn't have to worry. I mean, wonder why all this is happening. Well, we've had the guardrails pulled out. So I wanted to mention that GABA time period, that's
super important.
Yeah. So I think you and I both are giving a message of hope, but the hope is based on knowledge. Sir Francis Bacon said knowledge itself is power. And so we need to realize, and again, you're doing a great job of advocating this, that those young children need to be educated about sexuality. It needs to be done in the correct way.
Yeah, age appropriately, in the right time, in the right content of who that kid is. I mean, all of those things.
Yeah, and I think integrity. So I'll go back to it again. Sexual integrity education. Integrity needs to be the goal, the end goal, not sexualization and trying to have a young child, try it out for themselves. No,
or overly exposed to it, or
yeah, or inappropriate age, like you just said. So they're not made to handle a lot of things until, well, first of all, it doesn't make any sense to them until they get to puberty and start having the hormonal effects and all that. So there's a common sense approach to it. And as I was saying about the earlier, like 1900 to 1950 approach to sex ed, where it was looked at as hygiene, I think, and cautionary notes were put into it about what could happen, with the wrong use of it. I think that is the better approach. Although everything that we know scientifically that they didn't know back then, I think needs to be brought to bear. And again, for the purposes of creating great young men and women that most of them are probably going to choose to get married, hopefully, and have a family. The ones that don't, still will be great individuals, in our society and conduct themselves well and properly. That should be, I think, the goal of all this knowledge and all this scientific research that's been done, is to point out, the things that can positively affect human flourishing and not negatively affect it.
Amen, man. Well, look, I know our time's wrapping up, and I'm going to keep you on time. Thank you for your time again. Thank you for all your research and work and your heart and your passion for these things. I'd love to have you back on and talk about this in another 6 months. I think me and you could talk about stuff forever. So I think our conversations, I'm learning so much. I hope you are too. You guys visit Dr. Joe Malone on Instagram and Facebook, and then check his book out. It's on Amazon. Is it on BarnesandNoble.com? Battle of the Sexes. He's also the founder of Sex IQ, so you can go to that, www.sexiq.org. He's doing great work with just helping our society try to get healthier in the teen and young adult years, and man, do they need it. So thank you, Dr. Malone. I appreciate your time, and God bless you guys, and thanks for listening.